Well, welcome to Ottoman Empire Part 2. In this episode, we're going to take a look at the Ottoman Empire basically as it reached its height, and then talk about some of the things it represented, what they call the Golden Age for the Ottoman Empire, and then finish by talking about its slow but steady decline. All right, so where we left off last, the Ottomans had taken the city of Constantinople, renamed it Istanbul, and that was a big step forward for the Ottomans. Byzantine Empire was essentially gone. The Ottomans were the new show in town. So moving forward a couple of generations, we get to Selim the Grim. Selim the Grim was the grandson of Mehmet II, so he was fairly close timeline-wise to the transition to the Ottomans being in and the Byzantine Empire being out. He's worthy of mentioning in part because he was a very effective leader. A lot of land was conquered. A lot of expansion happened during his time. He also engaged in some things that appropriately give him the name the Grim, and that was basically killing off just about anybody that could potentially be a replacement to him as a person in power. Because he will end up eliminating everyone but a single son to eventually replace him, thus making Selim the Grim a very effective name. But just one thing to take a look at as far as the expansion that took place under this guy's leadership. If you look at the map up there, you can see the areas shaded in green as the land that was acquired by the Ottomans by 1520, as this map shows. Quite a bit of expansion. You can see into parts of Europe, part of what we call the Middle East, and on into northern parts of Africa in some cases, including where Egypt is located. And in addition to that, when you think in terms of an Islamic empire, very important cities in the Muslim world were acquired by the Ottomans as well, Mecca and Medina specifically. And then just one other thing that I think is worth pointing out, we're talking specifically about the Ottoman Empire right now, but I think it's important to keep track of other things that are happening at a similar time. And so if you look at the early 1500s, like we're talking about now under Selim the Grim, that was the same time the Spanish were exploring the Americas and was not too far removed from Columbus's voyage across the Atlantic Ocean and discovering what we would soon understand was new land and new territory. So one thing that's important to always remember is the events that are happening in one part of the world are not happening in isolation, but they are happening. Lots of different things end up happening at similar times, and that's certainly true at this time. All right, so the next important person to talk about, and this is a person that really represents the height of Ottoman power and Ottoman leadership, and that's a guy by the name of Suleiman. And a lot of people end up referring to him as Suleiman the Magnificent. People at the time referred to him as Suleiman the Lawgiver. He was the one remaining son from Selim the Grim, and so when Selim died, he took over. And it would be under his leadership that the Ottoman Empire would get to its greatest extent, both territory-wise as well as by many other measures. And so just one thing to point out, for this being a significant leader, it's important to note how long this guy was in power, and the fact that he was in power this long. It's nice that he was a good leader as leaders go. He was in power from 1520 to 1566, so that's a good long time, 46 years. As far as territorial gains, you can see a picture up there. You can see that he expanded territory compared to what was held by the Ottomans before he came to power. He did most of that just in the first few years that he was in power, so he actually spent a great deal of the time that he was in charge of the Ottoman Empire really kind of organizing and consolidating and just kind of making what they had as good as it could be. And at this stage in time, he was probably one of the most significant rulers in all of the world. As I was saying before, probably one of the things he's most noted for was just simply how he managed the empire. One of the things he worked on was creating a law code. One of the things we generally see throughout history is places that have a systematized code of laws, something that can be known, something that's written down, something that's followed, tend to be well-organized, orderly places. When it came to tax collection, always an important thing. when you're talking about some kind of government system, uh, whether we like taxes or not, for a government to operate, it takes resources. And one of the things that Suleiman was able to do was really simplify the process and be very efficient about collecting the money that was needed for the Ottoman Empire to operate. And something he continued to do, which had been true prior to his arrival, but was important to continue to be true, was how people were treated within the empire, in particular people who were non-Muslim. And under his leadership, Christians, Jews, whatever the faith perspective was, they were able to continue to practice their faith as they had always done. And so when you think in terms of people feeling generally satisfied and within the empire and being unlikely to rebel and revolt, things went pretty well during the time that he was in power. Now, something that's kind of interesting within the Ottoman system was something called the Devsherme system, which was a way in which slaves were utilized for various purposes throughout the empire. The idea of slavery, the idea of a slave, definitely has powerfully negative connotations in our country and with our country's history. And I think it's important to know that when we're talking about a slave system in the Ottoman Empire, that it probably operated more like an employment kind of system. There certainly would be some restrictions on what might be possible for you, depending on your status and exactly what role you had within this system. But I think it's important to understand that this was not a system of brutality. This was not a system of exploitation. That this was really probably more of an employment type of system than anything. And so, for example, if you were the Sultan, you definitely had opportunity to have a lot of people supporting you. So throughout this, or from this Devsherme system, there were some 20,000 people that personally attended to the Sultan. So whatever need he could have might be taken, would be taken care of. Now, maybe more importantly within this Devsherme system was the people, or were the people that were a part of what were called the Janissaries. This was an elite soldier group that served the Sultan specifically. And part of what's interesting about this, and this is part of why I say this Devsherme system, even though the term slave is used, was probably more of an employment type system than anything, is that the way they would fill out this Janissary Corps, for example, is boys from conquered Christian territories would be selected to be trained up as soldiers, and the ones that proved to be most capable, hardworking, had the aptitude for what they needed to do, could rise to high levels within the Ottoman Empire if they worked hard enough and were capable enough. In fact, you could come in as a slave boy and trained to be a part of the Janissaries and potentially rise to be the person directly beneath the Sultan in the power structure within the Ottoman Empire. So even though in the beginning a lot of people resisted this because they didn't like the idea of their boys being taken and trained this way and put to work this way, one thing that would happen is over time people would realize what an opportunity it was. And so in a lot of ways, families would desire their boys to be taken into this system and trained up for the opportunities it would provide, much the same way within our society today as if a prestigious university contacted your parents and said, we want your son or daughter to come to our university to study. We will pay for it. We'll see to it that they get a job when they're done, and it'll all work. I imagine most parents would be thrilled at the idea of their child getting a free education and being set up with employment. And that's really what this kind of system was. And so part of what helped the Ottoman Empire function so well was the way in which they utilized the human resources that they had very effectively. Now, like all empires, they rise and then they fall. And at the end of Suleiman's reign, really marked the beginning of decline for the Ottoman Empire. And part of that was kind of building on what had happened with Selim the Grim, his father, and that was doing away with, killing, exiling, otherwise suppressing potential heirs to the throne because they were perceived as threats to power. And so what would end up happening is a tradition of sorts began that though there might have been many sons that could potentially replace a sultan, basically one would be allowed to really have that opportunity, and they usually picked somebody who didn't seem to be the best person for that kind of a job. So people that looked like they could be a rival and could be a threat to the sultan's power would either be killed or otherwise isolated such that they wouldn't receive education, they wouldn't be trained up in anything, and therefore not a threat. And so what you ended up having is kind of like the worst candidate, kind of generation after generation, serving as the sultan. And it's not surprising that over time problems would develop. And so, as I was saying before, it became customary to do this, and so weak leaders became the norm moving forward. Nevertheless, the Ottoman Empire would continue to exist for several hundred years, and it wouldn't be until the conclusion of World War One that the Ottoman Empire would cease to exist in name and would, a portion of it that remained would form the country of Turkey that we still have in place today. And so that's just a little bit on the Ottoman Empire, a little bit about the rise and fall. Again, a significant Islamic empire, a significant empire overall, even though we might not think about it as much in our part of the world. So hopefully this has been informative and helpful, and you know a little bit about one of the world's most significant empires. Thanks for watching.